Welcome to BRITE Old Testament 506 Hebrew Exegesis. I'm looking forward to a great semester. My name is Kyle Ferguson and I will be your professor for this class as we consider how the exegesis of Hebrew impacts our understanding of the Old Testament text. Well, let's dig in. The first question to consider as we dive into Hebrew exegesis is, what is exegesis? Not just Hebrew exegesis, or English exegesis, or Greek exegesis, but exegesis in general. Exegesis is reading meaning out of a text, as opposed to eisegesis, which is reading meaning into a text. The process of exegesis is seeking to determine the original meaning of a text in its original context to its original audience. Some points of clarification are necessary for each part of this definition. By original meaning, we mean the meaning as the first or original author intended his or her message. Many texts within Scripture take on a later meaning as the texts are reinterpreted to a particular setting, perhaps in the New Testament. For instance, Melchizedek in Genesis 14 is reinterpreted as a type of Christ in Hebrews 7. Of course, the writer of Hebrews is not being imaginative. Melchizedek really is a type of Christ, the King of Peace, the King of Righteousness, Melech Zedek. However, this is not what Moses initially intended when he wrote Genesis 14. His focus is more on the actions of Abraham and his relationship with Melchizedek. Melchizedek is an important part of Genesis 14, but Moses' point, Moses' meaning, is not that Melchizedek was a foreshadowing of Christ, even if both Psalm 110 and Hebrews 7 make that point later. All of which means that as we study Genesis 14, we must consider Genesis 14 as it was originally intended. This is where the original context and the original audience play such a large role. We, in the modern era of the 21st century, are an audience of Genesis 14, but we are not the original audience. While our 21st century reading impacts the application of the text, the meaning of the text is grounded in the ancient Near Eastern context of the people of Israel, most likely on the plains of Moab. Thus, before we attempt to apply the text of Genesis 14, and application is really within the realm of homiletics, we must exegete the passage as it would have been understood by the original Israelites, as it was first delivered to them by Moses, alongside the rest of the Pentateuch. While it is certainly appropriate to consider Old Testament texts in light of New Testament texts, Hebrew exegesis, Old Testament exegesis, is concerned with understanding the meaning of an Old Testament text in its original Old Testament context as it was written to an Old Testament audience. Once that task is complete, the exegete may move on to the New Testament, may move on to application to a modern audience, but exegesis in the Old Testament is not concerned with today's audience, and is really not even concerned with the New Testament, but is concerned with the Old Testament, with those who originally received the Word of God from the Old Testament servants. What exactly then is Hebrew exegesis, especially as we compare Hebrew exegesis to English exegesis or Greek exegesis? Greek exegesis is typically exegesis of the New Testament, but there are ancient Old Testament translations of the Bible in Greek, for instance the Septuagint, in which case Greek exegesis would be appropriate. An English exegesis is necessary for those who are studying an English translation of the Bible and don't know Hebrew or Greek. The best way to describe Hebrew exegesis is as a roadmap. Here we have this map with you in the middle. You are here. This dot represents Hebrew exegesis. However, there is a larger picture of exegesis in general. Here on this map, we have a dot on the left-hand side that is green. We have a dot on the right-hand side that is red. These are still part of the exegetical process, however, they are not Hebrew exegesis. So in order to orient ourselves in terms of what is Hebrew exegesis, we need to examine it in light of the other parts of the exegetical process. The exegetical process can be divided up into three categories: behind the text, which is sometimes called around the text; in front of the text, and where we are, in the text. This is really a roadmap for the exegetical process. As we begin, we start with behind the text, the background information to the text itself. Who wrote the text? Who is the author? Many times, the author of a particular text is quite significant. We even have some sections of Scripture that are written by Gentiles, which is really surprising for a Hebrew Old Testament and yet is crucial to understanding the interpretation of the text. When is the writing taking place? Is it being written prior to the exile, during the exile, after the exile, during the reign of the patriarchs or the reign of the judges, or during the early monarchy? Where is the text being written? Is it being written in Babylon or in Jerusalem? Or perhaps it's being written in the plains of Moab, such as with Moses. Who is the audience? Is it being written to the early Israelites? Perhaps, as with much of Numbers, it's being written to the second generation of Israelites that have come out of Egypt. And what about the literary context, the immediate literary context of the rest of the particular book that a passage is found in? What is the theology of that particular book? And what about the impact of other texts from the Old Testament upon this particular text, especially if a book is found in a major section such as the Minor Prophets, which is sometimes called the 12 Scrolls, or within the Pentateuch? In front of the text has to do with the response that the author is seeking to bring about. What application does the author want? To some degree, application in terms of modern application is not quite the same as in front of the text, because the author is not thinking of modern application. The author is thinking of application in their particular setting. So in front of the text has to do with the response that they wanted at that particular time. Where we are is in the text. We are addressing the Hebrew text itself and examining the text to understand the meaning. Of course, this is part of the larger exegetical process, but behind the text and in front of the text are not really Hebrew exegesis as much as in the text, where we are dealing with the Hebrew text itself. What exactly do we mean when we say in the text? In the text has to do with the multifaceted nature of the text itself. For instance, what is the genre of the text? Are we dealing with prose? Are we dealing with poetry? Are we dealing with history or apocalyptic literature? Even within apocalyptic literature, are we dealing with prophetic apocalyptic literature, or are we dealing with eschatology? What about syntax? What do we mean when we say that there is a verbless clause or a purpose clause? What about structure? How does the text itself flow together within verses and paragraphs? What about grammar? Why did an author use a particular word or a particular stem of the verb? Why did he use a particular noun or a particular word choice? What about textual criticism? Is the Hebrew text the most accurate, or is there a better understanding of what the text might have said in previous versions of the Hebrew text, as revealed in the Samaritan Pentateuch or in the Septuagint? What about punctuation? Why is the text divided the way that it's divided based upon the punctuation of the Masoretic markings? What about word choice? What do the words that the author chose actually mean in the way that he uses them? Perhaps in the rest of the book, the rest of the section, perhaps in the Pentateuch, how that word is used in the Old Testament. What about the immediate literary context? Perhaps the verse before, the verse after, the verses in the rest of the chapter. These are all questions concerned with the actual text of the Old Testament, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. This is where we are when we say we are dealing with Hebrew exegesis, exegeting in the text, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Our goal for this class then is threefold. We want to grow first in our understanding of how to do exegesis. Not just Hebrew exegesis, but any exegesis. Really, all of exegesis is very similar even though Hebrew exegesis is related directly to the Hebrew text. So hopefully in this class you will not only grow in your understanding of Hebrew exegesis, you will also grow in your understanding of exegesis in general. Second, we want to grow in our understanding of Hebrew so that we can do more effective Hebrew translation for the sake of exegesis. Again, this class is not specifically related just to Hebrew. Although we sometimes call it Hebrew 3, it is not the same as Hebrew 1 and 2, where we were learning the language. The goal of this class is to understand how to do Hebrew translation specifically for the sake of exegesis. How do we exegete and determine the meaning of a text? And then third, we want to grow in our knowledge of the Bible and our knowledge of the God of the Bible. We're doing exegesis in this class, but it's not as though we're simply solving a puzzle for the sake of solving a puzzle. Instead, we are exegeting a text. We are understanding that text, the inspired word of God, in order to understand what exactly it is that God is communicating to us in His word. In that sense, we will grow in our knowledge of the Bible, but also our hope is that we will grow in our understanding of who God is, as He has revealed Himself within His written word in the Hebrew Old Testament. Now that we have defined Hebrew exegesis, moving forward, our lectures will include two parts. The first part of each lecture will be directly applicable to the exegetical process, usually explaining one part or piece of the process. For example, what are techniques in textual criticism, as we seek to interpret the text by first determining what is the correct text. This is true of pretty much any sort of language exegesis, but since we'll be using the Hebrew text, it's especially applicable to Hebrew exegesis. The second part of our lectures will include an indirect application to exegesis, and that is increasing our knowledge of the Hebrew language. For example, how do we use Hebrew verbless clauses? Again, we are dealing in Hebrew exegesis, so we need to know Hebrew as best as possible. When we put these two pieces together, we get an emphasis upon Hebrew exegesis, working within the Hebrew language, using the exegetical process to determine the meaning of a text. At this point, we are ready to move on to the second part of our lecture, that is, dealing with the nuance of the Hebrew language. The particular characteristic of the Hebrew language that I'd like to look at today concerns the accents. The accents in the Hebrew Bible can be divided up into two sections. The first is the three, including Psalms, Job, and Proverbs. The second section are the 21, which is how many books you have left over if you use the Hebrew division of books. The accents in the 21 are all the same. There is some overlap between the accents in the 21 and the accents in the 3, but there are also several differences which we will look at. Keep in mind that we are using specifically Tiberian Masoretic pointing. There are other forms of accents of other texts, but this is the text that we are using in the Masoretic text that is found in our BHS. This pointing has three main purposes. Stress, indicating the accent syllable, including all the rules that we have learned regarding vowels and accents. Cantillation, which has to do with how we actually read the text. And syntax, indicating which words go with which words. Stress and cantillation we have already talked about even in elementary Hebrew, so our primary focus today will be on syntax. Within Hebrew accents, we have two categories, disjunctive and conjunctive. Disjunctive divide up the words of a sentence into smaller clauses. Conjunctive actually add words together, demonstrating a syntactical relationship between words. Within disjunctive accents, we have four categories: emperor, king, prince, duke. These are not categories that are recent, these are categories that go all the way back to the medieval rabbis, where they spoke of the accents in these categories. The emperor is the highest level of authority. These are the major disjunctive accents. Each level, then, is in service to the level above, which will make sense in just a moment. Thus, the lowest form is the duke. These levels of accent divide the sections of the prince into smaller sections. The prince divides the section of the king into smaller sections, and the king divides the sections of the emperor into smaller sections. Again, this will make sense as we move forward, but just understand that each set of accents is serving the accent category above. At the disjunctive emperor level of Hebrew accents, we actually have 3 accents, although you'll notice that 2 of these are the combination of 2 accents. The first is sof pasuk and saluk, which occurs at the end of every verse in the Hebrew Bible. Sof pasuk is the colon-like symbol highlighted in purple at the end of the word, showing that you have reached the end of the sentence. Saluk is the little line under the middle letter of this word that occurs on the accent syllable of the final word of the verse, indicating pause, telling you to slow down before you reach the sof pasuk. It is always found just before sof pasuk in this final word, and will typically change the word into pausal form. So eretz becomes aretz. The second accent here is atnak. Atnak occurs in both the 21 and the 3. In the 21, it will divide a verse into 2 parts. In the 3, it will divide short verses into 2 parts. However, it will often be used to divide longer verses into 4 parts, dividing the first half of a sentence, not in terms of word count, but in terms of sense, dividing the first half of the verse into 2 parts, thereby making quarters, as the second half of the sentence will have a separate disjunctive doing the same thing. The accent mark that divides a verse in the 3 in half is ol veyored, which is a combination of 2 accents, mercha, which is the last syllable here, and mahupach, which is on the first syllable here. The little lines next to the accent marks indicate that these both occur at the end of their syllables, but they may actually be in 2 words, where mahupach occurs on the first word and mercha may end up on the second word. This is the strongest disjunctive accent in the 3. It functions the way the atnak functions in the 21, dividing a verse in half by sense. The next level of disjunctive accents are the kings. The kings are in service to the emperors. The emperors either ended a verse or divided a verse in half. The kings divide those halves into halves, thereby dividing the verse into quarters. These 3 accents, or families of accents listed here, are found only in the 21. They do not occur in the 3 books of Psalms, Jobs, or Proverbs. There are 2 accents in some places listed here because the second is a rare form of the first, replacing it from time to time, but it is not necessary to know the name of the second because of how rare it occurs. You should be familiar with the name of the first in each list, although the level of kings is pretty much the last level of disjunctive accents where you need to be familiar with the name. A zakef, which is either a zakef katon or a zakef gadol, divides atnak sections, dividing a sentence into quarters, either dividing the first half of the verse into quarters or the second half into quarters. A segolta, which is replaced very rarely by a shalshelet, divides only the first atnak section. If segolta occurs, it will never be found in the second half of the verse. Occasionally, segolta will mark the end of the first third of the verse, but again, that is not as common as it dividing the first atnak section into a quarter. Tifka is located here in our list under kings because from time to time, Tifka may divide a verse. However, most often Tifka divides zakef sections in longer verses, thereby actually making Tifka more of a prince because it's in service to zakef, which is a king. But you need to be familiar with Tifka because of the fact that it may divide short verses in half. Although there are 4 levels of disjunctive accent, I'm only going to mention 3, and I'm only going to highlight 2 that are in the 3rd prince level because of how common they are. Ravia, which may divide a zakef, a segolta, or a tifka section, is the little diamond shaped over the middle letter of this word. It will divide those other sections into halves, thereby dividing the sentence into eighths, or perhaps in a tifka section, dividing the verse in quarters if tifka only divides the verse in half. Pashta divides a Zakaf section into halves, or may divide a Ravia section within a Zakaf section. In that sense, Pashta may be a prince if it's serving the king Zakaf, or it may actually be a duke if it is serving the prince Ravia. Pashta will be found on the last letter of the word, but if that particular letter is not the accent syllable, Pashta will be found a second time on the same word, with the second syllable being marked being the accent syllable. Thus, you'll see Pashta at the end and on the accent syllable. Again, this is the prince level. These two are very common within the Hebrew text as disjunctive accents. I'm only going to highlight 4 types of accents that are found in the 3. Several of the accents from the 21 also occur in the 3 and have similar functions. For instance, Segolta also shows up in the 3 and divides the first section just as it does in the 21. Tzinor is an accent that divides the Segolta sections in the poetic books into sections. This same accent occurs in the 21, but there it is called Zarka and is a fairly inferior level accent. Ravias act like Tifka in the 3, although Tifka does not occur in the 3. There are several different kinds of Ravias. Ravia Mugrash, which is the first one in the list here on the left, with both the diamond over the final letter and the funny comma-looking symbol over the second letter. Ravia and Ravia Gadol also occur. They are the ones with only the diamond. Ravia Gadol occurs only before Ol Veyored. Otherwise, it is always simply Ravia. I'm mentioning Deki here, which divides Atnak sections only, because Deki looks just like a Tifka, although Deki will always occur on the final letter of the word, what we call post-positive. Tifka does not occur in the 3, so when you see what looks like a Tifka symbol at the end of a word in the 3, it is actually Deki, dividing up that Atnak section. As I mentioned, it's really only necessary to learn the names of the emperors and the king disjunctive accents. You may choose to remember the 2 prince accents that I highlighted, Ravia and Pashta, as those do occur fairly often. But beyond that, the names are not really important to memorize. Neither is it absolutely necessary to memorize the names of the disjunctives that I highlighted in the 3. It's also not absolutely crucial to memorize the names of the conjunctive accents that are found in the 21, 5 of which I have listed here. However, I have highlighted these and their names because they occur fairly often. Remember, a conjunctive conjoins this particular word with what follows. Typically, the following word will have a disjunctive accent, further emphasizing the fact that the words with the conjunctive and the disjunctive go together. Each of these particular conjunctives serves a particular type of disjunctive, although it's not necessary for you to memorize that bit of information either. These are Mercha, Munach, Mahupech, Azla, which is also called Kadma, and looks a lot like Pashta, although Pashta is a disjunctive accent that comes on the last syllable of the word, not on the first, and Darga, which is the little S symbol that shows up under the accent syllable. Again, it's not necessary to know the names, but to be familiar with what these symbols look like, because you will see them repeatedly in the text, and they give you a crucial bit of information of what word this word is joined with. I'm sure by now that you're wondering, as we consider the Hebrew accents, why any of this matters. Well, let me suggest just 2 reasons why it matters. First, it matters because it tells us what the pronunciation is of a word, which is significant when we have words that look the same. For instance, we have shavu, which means they took captive, and we have shavu, which means they returned. The accent mark is what separates these 2 verbs. One has the emphasis on the bait, one has the emphasis on the shin, telling us that this is actually 2 different verbs. Of course, that's pretty specific and not something that you need to be able to recognize right away, but you need to at least be familiar with the fact that this is what accents can do for us in exegesis. The second has to do with the interpretation of Deuteronomy 26:5. We have Arami Oved Avi. Arami is Aramean, Oved is a participle, pursuing, and Avi is my father. Deuteronomy 26:5 is translated by a lot of English translations as, "My father was a wandering Aramean." The problem is that's not what the text says based on the accents. Arami is Aramean, but it has a pashta, which is a disjunctive accent. Therefore, the Masoretes have separated Arami away from Oved Avi. So it is not Oved Arami together, a wandering Aramean, but an Aramean pursuing my father. This changes the meaning of the text because it indicates why his father, which is Jacob, went down to Egypt to get away from an Aramean. And who was the Aramean? Probably Laban. Thus, the disjunctive and conjunctive accents in this particular verse have helped us to understand the text more fully and to fully indicate what exactly the text meant. In this lecture, we have defined exegesis, and specifically Hebrew exegesis, laying out a roadmap for what exactly we're going to be doing in this semester, doing the process of Hebrew exegesis. We also took a look at the Hebrew accent system, laying out the conjunctive and disjunctive accents in the 21 and the 3. Often at the end of a lecture, I will reference the fact that there is a Quizlet available, and there is a Quizlet available to help you learn the Hebrew accents if you so desire. However, it is not necessary that you take your level of knowledge of the Hebrew accent symbols to that level, but if you suddenly have free time on your hands and can't find anything better to do, it's not a bad idea to learn some of the information related to the accents. At the end of each class, you will also be assigned a number of vocabulary words for the next class. Those vocabulary words should be memorized prior to coming to class. A quiz can be found on Canvas, and that quiz should also be taken prior to coming to class. Each class may also have assigned reading that you should complete before coming to class, and typically there will be an assigned passage that should be exegeted prior to coming to class, so that you come with a completed translation and parsings for the forms of the word that are found in each verse that is assigned. This particular class does not have an assigned passage, as we will be doing our first exegetical passage together in class, but in the future you will need to have such prepared. Handwritten notes are fine, but please bring them with you to class so that you can show me that you have actually done your work beforehand. So take this time now, if necessary, to go back and review the slides here, if there's anything that you still need to learn and to solidify in your mind. Prepare the vocab for the next class, do any necessary reading, and I look forward to seeing you in our first in-person class.